I'm live. Hello. I'm okay. So today is a day when I have to look at multiple screens in order to have a coherent conversation with you. Happy Harry Styles album release day to all who celebrate. It's a big day. We have waited a long time to get some news, some music, and now we get everything. So if you're celebrating with me, what a happy day it is. I've been trying to listen to the album in between lives and work and everything, but so far so good. So I hope you're enjoying it. Hi. My name's Ellie. If you've never met me, if this is wild and brand new for you, um yeah, sorry about that. Bear with me. My name's Ellie. I am what I call a citizen journalist. I may be working my way up to independent journalist status at some point, but I am somebody who came to this world with no idea that I was going to step into journalism, and yet here I am. And in so doing, I've, I haven't done it myself, but built up a community of just great people who are excited about helping and have investigative skills and work in every kind of background or are unemployed or doesn't matter, have a passion for reading and helping people. And people have come and gathered together to help us solve the Epstein files, which I didn't know I was going to be here. I'm guessing you didn't know you were going to be here, but I'm really glad that we're here. So today we're going to talk about some of this stuff. We're going to talk about two things today. Secondly, but I'll talk about it. I'll introduce it first. I wrote another piece on Michael Wolff this week. I'm not out to get Michael Wolff, but it's one of those things. We're all faced with the opportunity in these files and in this time in history to come to a point where we realize the people that we looked up to may have failed us, which is unfortunate, but that is the objectivity of the Epstein files. It's not political, folks. It is not the people we thought were nice or smart or funny or interesting. It is bad choices made by a large swath of people in certain circles, and it doesn't matter whether we like them or not, it doesn't matter whether we looked up to them or not. And so Michael Wolff is one of those people for me who I did look up to for a long time, who I was very interested in his writing. I have his books. I was a paid subscriber. I was so excited when he came to Substack. And then, looking through the files, I've had to come to a realization that he may not have been on the right side of history. He may not have been out for the good of humanity and the safety of women and girls. He may have been out for Michael Wolff, and that's disappointing, but it definitely needs to be talked about, but also not just to out someone as being, a bad guy, but potentially somebody who needs to be looked into as far as the information that he holds and what effect that would have on the outcome of this case, which I think is vitally important. So I'll talk about that. Secondly, only because we got some very important files from the DOJ last night. Last week, NPR released an article by two, and I'm not going to be able to find them right now. Two different journalists. It was co-written by two journalists about missing files, that there had been something called 302s in the DOJ. And a 302 is basically an interview given by the FBI to a witness. So some sort of, I don't know if you'd call it a deposition, an interview, but a documented interview with somebody who has information. They discovered that this was missing by some sort of very smart algorithm that she tried to explain to me, and I didn't obviously retain, because I had approached one of the journalists and said, before we got this, I said, is there a way to figure out what at least the file numbers were for the missing documents, even if we don't have those missing documents? Because if you look at the DOJ files, they're in chronological order, so you can tell if something's missing, right? The number is missing. And so I said, do we know what those file numbers are? And she said, no, we don't even have that. And so they did something very smart, which I, again, cannot reiterate because it's too smart for me. And they figured out that there were 53 missing pages that were actually 4 FBI interviews, also called 302s, with the same woman. What does that mean? If you or I were to come forward with saying we had information about a case, something illegal, there would be steps between us announcing that and then us sitting down with an FBI agent, right? There's steps that different departments or different law enforcement would take leading up to that. So whatever those steps were, this woman had completed all those steps. They found her credible enough to sit down with an FBI agent. And then they found her credible enough to sit with the same FBI agents 4 times. That's important. Because if somebody comes in and they say, especially since this is 2019, right? This is after he was arrested. So they're being very careful because all of a sudden this was big news, right? So they're going to get more people who go, oh, wow, I want to be involved in this story. And so they have to be very careful. And so there would not be a lot of people who got to the point of sitting down with the FBI. And yet again, this woman sat down with them 4 different times. The part that is important, and the part that is important about citizen journalism, is these 2 journalists who are not citizen journalists, they're we probably have journalism degrees, wrote the article, did the digging, did great journalism, and then people continued to dig after they said something. And as has happened with most of these file drops, it feels, I can't say that it is, but it feels as though the results of us getting the files had much to do with people yelling, screaming, putting it all over social media, blaring it with their bullhorns, to the point where the DOJ gave it to us. There was probably some threats involved with Congress. I don't know. But I'm just saying, I think the reason we have anything right now is for that same reason, is that we are not going to be quiet about any of this. But also, the importance of these 4 interviews and why we did not have them is they pertain to Donald Trump. And again, abuse of a child between the ages of 13 and 16, same child over the course of years, who is abused by Epstein in similar fashion to what we're used to, by Donald Trump, and then by a 3rd man named Jim Atkins. We only got 16 pages. So the 3 interviews that we got were 16 pages out of 53. So we are still missing 1 interview that was the longest of the 4, that is 37 pages long, which is significant that the interview was 37 pages long and we don't have it. It's also significant that we didn't have it in the first place and that it was about Donald Trump, which is the vast majority of the files that we don't have. I said this to Waj earlier. If you or I were documented for 30 years of our life, let's say that we were that important that somebody documented us and had files on us for 30 years of our life. And for 15 of those years, we had a best friend who did every social event with us, was involved in our finances, ran businesses with us, dabbled in real estate with us for 15 years as a best friend. Wouldn't you think in those 3.5 million files that we'd see 15 years worth of that friend? And yet we don't see any of it. That's significant. That's significant. When people call this a cover-up, that's literally covered up. We don't have it. So anyway, some significant things about this specific set of interviews. Just, for housekeeping purposes, I found it very interesting, and maybe this is just a legality thing. The redactions in it. Most of the redactions are like pronouns, right? And it's a whole paragraph referencing the woman that we know as a woman because it identifies her as female. And then you'll have these little tiny redactions that are obviously she and her. And it made me wonder, like, why is that important to redact those when it could only pertain to her? Like, there's not talking about anybody else in this paragraph, so why would you redact the pronouns of the person you're talking about? I don't know. I don't have that answer. I naively thought that I could just sit down and read 16 pages of this today and give you a full report, and also read some of them last night, and I'm finding so much information in them that I did not get through the 16 pages. Like 16 pages is nothing. We've got millions of files. But I found myself stopping and like searching and Googling and looking up like dean's lists and benefactors and little details that I was finding. So, for example, you have this man named Jim Atkins who's described in these files. Also, okay, let me back up. Sorry, my brain's going. The things that I look for in these, because I know that there are lots of depositions in these files and that you always have to be, always open to the truth, open platform for people to tell their truth, but always, a healthy amount of skepticism, because there are things to be skeptical. There are people who gave depositions where, guess what? The only people in the room with Epstein were like Biden, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Mickey Mouse, right? And you go, that doesn't line up with anything that I've read anywhere in the files. I'm going to be skeptical of that, right? So I do come with an ounce of skepticism, but only so that I can do my homework well and verify the things that are verifiable. But not discount the things that aren't verifiable. Something else I talked about with Waj is like this idea of reading something and going, oh, I've read these thousands of files already. I know Epstein's MO. I know what he's like. I know what he did with every girl. I know he paid her $200 and then she went out to get a friend from high school and she brought her back and she made another $200 and he never left the house and blah, blah, blah. That was his MO. And so when I read something else and I see somebody describing Epstein differently, I go, that's not what he usually does. But I can't let my brain go there because I need to read the whole story. In this case, the things that are different is this is a story of something that would have happened in the 1980s, which is well before most of the stories that we've heard. Most of the things we heard were at least mid 90s, usually the late 90s, and then upwards. The most of the stories we hear go through about 2010, 2013. He was still doing it until the day he died, but like those are kind of the bulk of the stories. This is much earlier. And so in it, this woman describes things that I go, well, maybe, that's a little different. That's not what he usually did. Like, for example, she said she went to a Rick James concert in Savannah, Georgia, and that Epstein was there. And I go, oh, he doesn't usually go to concerts, or, just like more social events. Whereas I knew him as, not knew him. I've read of him being a much less social person and doing things in his own home. But if this was really the 1980s, he was a much younger man, right? He was in a different state of finances. He would have been up and coming. If he was developing all these relationships that he became the kingpin of later on, he would have been doing more socializing and being with more people and going and doing more often. So it's not unlikely he would have been much, much, much younger. And so I take that with a grain of salt because I go, oh, okay, that doesn't necessarily need to be the thing that I know. The thing that I know is when he was like 50, right? This would have been when he's like 30. Okay, so back to this guy named Jim Atkins. He is a big player in these documents that we have, meaning like he's mentioned quite a bit. And the story that this woman tells is very specific. She gives very unique details where my brain goes, if I thought somebody wasn't being truthful, the details would be more vague, or they'd be more cliche, or they'd be more like things you've heard of a story of sexual assault. These details are very unique. you have this man named Jim Atkins, who she describes over and over again. And they say that his name is phonetic, so it could have been Adkins, it could have been something similar, but that he worked in some kind of educational setting, university setting, college setting in Ohio, which would have been a place Epstein was hanging out in the 1980s because he was getting to know Leslie Wexner, who is a kingpin of the Ohio education system, has been, and there are departments and buildings and hospitals named after him because he's donated millions and millions and millions of dollars. So that is a unique detail that maybe all of us would think about now, but in 2019, maybe not thinking about as much. The other reason that Jim Atkins stuck out for me, who she said was potentially dating her mother, she said her mother had been sober for a long time, but because she was dating Jim Atkins, there was some sort of a blackmail where they'd gotten hold of a picture of her because she had been sex trafficked, like very similarly to all these other girls. And there was a photo of her, and her mother was desperately trying to get this photo back because it wasn't the age of the internet. You could physically get a photo back. And that she had done all sorts of things, work-wise to try to get that back. That may not have been on the up and up as far as like money. This guy Atkins and Epstein are coming to her office. They're involving themselves in her, I believe, real estate business. And then eventually she sees her mom sort of crumbling. She said her mom had been doing great for a long time. And then all of a sudden, her mom, who'd been sober for a long time, started drinking again. And she knew that whatever it was, which her mom, she didn't know till later what was going on, was very hard and very and really specific details about how it affected her mother. But the reason why Atkins stuck out in my head is because later on, in the later 1990s, we had the Journal of the Unknown Survivor. And the Journal of the Unknown Survivor describes a man named Mr. Atkins. Now, do we know that this is the same Mr. Atkins? No, we don't know. But it's going to stick out and it's going to be important because now that I have that name in two places from two different people who didn't know each other, who would have been writing at two different times in two different places, did I already say that? That's a little bit of credibility if I could figure out who Mr. Atkins is. So I further began to dig. And something that she describes a lot in this document, A, is something called, let me pull it up if I have it. Sure, I don't have it. Hold on. Let me look this up. Epstein drug plant. What is it called? This is me not knowing the names of things. Okay. Is that like scopolamine? Yeah, scopolamine. Okay. Devil's breath. And a lot of you guys are very versed in that. I am not. But there was evidence that Epstein would grow a plant called scopolamine. It's a South American flower, I believe. There's a YouTube, like a little short documentary about the power of this drug. But the one thing that it does is it doesn't make you unconscious. So it's not like something that makes you pass out, but it makes you have no will. So you can see yourself doing something. You're aware, you can see, you can hear, you can smell, but you have no willpower to resist anything. So if somebody tells you to do something, you'll do it. So it's a very dangerous drug. I mean, it can kill you, but it's also a very powerful date rape drug because you can basically drug somebody into consenting to anything. And that was something that has come up again and again in the files as potentially something that Epstein had access to. And so in this, she's describing being drugged. The second thing that I was digging into that I will take me down another rabbit hole, but is this idea that she lived on an island. And this was not Jeffrey Epstein's island. This is the 80s. He didn't own the island. She's clearly an American kid. And so I had started to figure out, like, okay, what islands are we talking about? Like, what are some details that I can find in these documents that can tell me potentially where she lives? Because then she's saying this Jim Atkins guy rented or owned a house also on the same island. And she said it was a very small island. It was a place where she knew everybody, right? So when she was brought to Epstein's, wherever he was, if he was at Mr. Atkins' house, and she didn't recognize the girls who were also there, she thought that that was very strange because this island was very small and she would have known girls if they were brought to his house. And so I started looking for details of like, what island could she possibly be talking about? And again, she mentioned going to this Rick James concert in Savannah, Georgia. And so I looked up Rick James concerts in Savannah, Georgia, and there were some in the pretty early 80s. So he would have been young if this was happening. But then she says she drove home from the Rick James concert with Epstein back to the island. So I was like, okay, what islands are within driving distance of Savannah where they would have come home the same night? And there were a few. There were some in Georgia. And then I used, I don't know if you guys all saw the YouTube that showed how to detect the font behind the redactions. Like if you have a certain number of choices, like for co-conspirators, let's say you have 10 names, you could fit the font behind the redactions and see if it slides over and the words line up. So I did that with the islands. And I discovered that this is most likely Hilton Head, South Carolina, which has about 38,000 people on it. So it's not huge. It is within driving distance of Savannah, Georgia. And, it's not necessarily wealthy. You can be middle class or upper middle class, but there are definitely wealthy homes on it. So it would be a place where someone like a Mr. Atkins, who is a potential benefactor of Ohio State University or the University of Ohio or whatever, he could have had a second home there. And that's also a very popular like destination. And so I wrote that down. That is something I will be digging into. We need to find Mr. Atkins. Then there's another detail. She says that, so here's an example of something where I go, oh, that's not something that I know about Epstein. So she said his drink of choice was gin and tonic. I know Epstein from my research as a teetotaler, meaning he doesn't drink. But that doesn't mean that he always didn't drink. He was very young when this took place, so he very likely could have had a drink or two when he was out and developed his sobriety over time. I don't know. So I'm not gonna use that as a reason to go, oh, this couldn't possibly be. I'm gonna think about that. She said that he blared Neil Diamond. That was something he listened to a lot, classical music and Neil Diamond. Classical music makes sense. He was a classical pianist. He was very musical. He was often playing classical music on the piano in his home. But then I was like, oh, well then let's look up Neil Diamond. Are there things about Neil Diamond in the files? Yeah, there was a lot of emails about Neil Diamond music. Not Neil Diamond himself in the files, like he wasn't doing anything, but there were emails about Neil Diamond's music. Okay, maybe that lines up. Another specific detail. Again, I'm looking for things that are unique, that make it less likely that she's just making stuff up or thinking of something on a whim. And something she said, and this person verified, was she had a roommate who walked in wearing cologne, and it kind of triggered her, right? She all of a sudden had kind of like a panic attack based on the smell of this cologne, because it triggered her into remembering the smell, I think, of Epstein's cologne. I believe that's what it was. And she, she hadn't thought about it since then, but it was just like, when you smell something, like for me, the smell of the plastic in like baby dolls, that triggers me back to my childhood in a good way. But this in a bad way triggered her back to some of the abuse of Jeffrey Epstein. And so she, asked her roommate what it was, and he said he was wearing something called gray flannel. And so I looked up gray flannel cologne, and gray flannel cologne was very popular in the late 70s and early 80s. So, and this this would have been years later. So that is a unique detail. So again, I am not through all of these. I just want to like pour over them and see what I'm finding. But these are kind of some of the ways that we can pick up these really unique and specific details. And then start to dig, right? And start to figure out where she's talking about, who she's talking about. You know, people have come to me with names who have done a really good job digging, but then you just like have to verify, because if you get it wrong and you name somebody, that can really, really damage their reputation. So you have to get it right. And so we're going to keep digging. I know there's a lot of people looking at these documents right now. Very interesting that they gave them to us. This week has felt a little like a cluster with Iran, with these files, with a lot of the like political changeover in some of the states. You know, my people are all from Montana. Montana's politics this week have been wild. People were dropping out. Our senator dropped out 5 minutes before the filing deadline. People signed up who had no campaigns or websites or anything. Like everything's a mess, and it feels like people are scrambling. And so in the midst of that, I try to think about like what is the intent behind dropping these files now? Is it really because we were making a stink about it? Maybe. But I just feel like they don't have a long game plan. So we're gonna set that on the back burner for a minute. We're going to keep digging into these, but I would say pay attention to them. My guess is we will see the longer 4th interview. We may not see it right away, but my guess is that one has the most information. The first 2 that we had, one took place after Epstein was arrested, but before he died. So in that kind of little window of time in August. One took place, I believe, right after he died. They interviewed her again. And then one took place in October. So my guess is there is something in the middle between August and October, unless they did something like much, much more recent. My guess is there's probably like a September interview in there, but I don't know. We'll have to see. So if you guys want to dig into those, I posted them to my Substack. I can post them again in in the notes for this. I do recommend downloading them because I don't know how long they're going to let us keep these, but they are very interesting. And again, not that long. It's 16 pages, right? It's just chock full of information that we need to pay attention to. All right. Shall we switch over to Michael Wolff? Let me just pull up some information so we can do this right. Okay. Again, Michael Wolff. He is somebody, as a small business transcriber, he is what I always called, and what my husband knows him as the holy grail of transcription. 100 hours of interviews with Jeffrey Epstein. Okay. The reason I wrote about Michael Wolff this week, which was not my plan, I never really know what I'm writing about until I write about it, was because I started going through the files, and I'm not just going through page by page through the files. I knew when we got 3.5 million files, I had to be much more intentional and focusing on the things where I feel I do best. And I think the things that I do the best at are probably like email conversations and finding full dialogue and then looking for information within those conversations. I did it before when we got a whole bunch of emails, which I believe actually came from the Epstein estate in November. And it felt like a lot at the time. Now we know that wasn't a lot. But I went through like the Bannon emails. I went through Jez Staley's emails. I went through Michael Wolff's emails. Now we have 3.5 million files. And what I've done, there's ways to finagle looking for things in the Epstein search library. And I assume most people are familiar with that. But if you're not, if you look up DOJ Epstein library, it will open a search page with a search bar, and it's the entire Epstein library. Like, it's anything in the files that have to do with Epstein, so all the millions of pages, and there's a search bar, and you can search by terms. It's a little clunky. You can't be like, I want to look up Epstein, and I want to look up the year 1974, hypothetically, let's say. It will only look it up if those two things are in order, like if they're in a sentence next to each other. You cannot look up multiple search terms and have it find documents that include all of them. It just doesn't work that way. But if you can figure out how to look for things, all of a sudden you will have this dump of information. And so I've discovered ways of finding people's email conversations and only their email conversations, so I don't get like everything that includes their name, but just their conversations, by looking, last name, first name, from, colon, last name, looking up pseudonyms, like Prince Andrew had a lot of pseudonyms, but also, and without getting too in the weeds about this, when I search somebody's email thread, so for example, Michael Wolff came up with 1,800 pages of emails, and I click an email, sometimes it won't have anything in the body of the email. It will just have the date, to, from, and the subject. Well, if the subject is unique enough, I can then go search under that term of whatever the subject was, like dinner at 12 o'clock this afternoon, blah, blah, blah. I can search by that. Hopefully it will find that. Sometimes I have to search by the date and look for the email, all the emails under that date. Sometimes that happens. But if I can find that specific email and then search by it, I will get 10 to 12 versions of the same email, which is really helpful because then you get all the conversation leading up to that email and all the conversation that happened after that email, and you get the full thread. Also, oftentimes you'll get an email and you'll have a whole bunch of redactions in it. If I get 12 versions of that same email, I inevitably will get versions that are unredacted in different places, to where if I look at all 12 of those, I can create the whole email mostly unredacted. It's tedious, it takes a long time, but it's really, really helpful in figuring out what these people are talking about, because a lot of the redacted stuff is the stuff that they don't want us to read. In the case of Michael Wolff, more and more and more and more through these conversations that started very, very early. Remember, he was flying on Epstein's planes as early as like 1999, 2000, sometime around then. In these emails, you start to get the sinking sensation that he is not on the side of journalism and information, but he's on the side of the subjects he's writing about. And generally, those subjects he's writing about are controversial people. Mainly Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon. You have people like Steve Bannon who, supposedly lost his job at Breitbart because of things that Michael Wolff wrote about him in his books. And yet they're still hanging out after those books come out. They're still doing things together. So you start to go, well, is that what happened? Why, if somebody wrote a book that made somebody else lose their job, would they still be like, you want to go to lunch today? Like, that wouldn't make sense to me. But then stuff got dark. Like, then we started to deal with some of the darkness of their conversations and a little bit of what I call being a double agent, where Michael Wolff, as he is presenting himself as this like purveyor of truth and like endless information about bad people, when in fact he was befriending the bad people and asking them what information they wanted to go out in the newspapers and stifling journalism that they didn't want to go out. Like, if like in the case of Epstein, there were things going out by there's a journalist named Wayne Barrett, excuse me, who I believe is passed now. He's a very well-known journalist, very credible. And then another journalist named Tina. People think it may be Tina Brown. We don't know. Michael Wolff knows they're coming out with an article that's going to talk about Epstein and the stuff that Epstein actually did. And he asks Epstein, this is 2011, so this is fairly early. Let me think about Tina. She seems to have it in for you, and there are a lot of ways to neutralize her. And that's what he says to Epstein. And that is a fellow journalist. That is somebody who's out there telling the story. And he's asking Epstein if he can neutralize the story, meaning like get rid of it. We know that he was involved in a story with New York Magazine because a few months ago, if you guys remember, there was the photographer Christopher Anderson, who on his Instagram page posted a bunch of like really great photos, like very high quality photos inside Epstein's house, portrait photos. He's the same photographer who did all the like White House cabinet photos that felt very Wes Anderson. He found all these pictures on his hard drive of Epstein that he didn't know that he had. And it's because I believe in 2015 maybe, long time ago, there was a story that was supposed to come out by New York Magazine that was supposed to be written by Michael Wolff. And Christopher Anderson was a young photographer, and they hired him to do the photos for the story. And so he said, sure, of course, and he's talked about this. Like he has a really great rundown about this on his Instagram page. But he says, Epstein was like, you can't do anything with these photos. I own these photos. They're mine. And he said, he never made that kind of money before. So he was very excited. And of course he was going to do the story. Well, inevitably the story never happened. And so history happened, Epstein died, and then like in the last year, Christopher Anderson found these on his hard drive, and so he published them because he has the right to now. In these files, there is an email thread about that specific article. And the article has been written, and Michael Wolff is talking to the editors and talking to the people at New York Magazine, and they're going, we can't get a hold of Epstein, what's going on with the story? And he's like, I don't know, maybe I'll ask him. And meanwhile, the whole time he's like forwarding everything to Epstein. Like he's acting like he doesn't know why he disappeared. He doesn't know, what's going on. He's being flighty. Maybe he's not going to let us publish the story. But meanwhile, he's forwarding the entire thread that he's having with the magazine to Epstein and going like, what do you think? What do you want to do? Man, it's cold in Paris. Like he was playing both sides of the coin. But it gets darker than that. James Patterson was writing a book. And love him or hate him, James Patterson was writing a book on Epstein, right? It was everything. And Michael Wolff, as a well-known author at that time, reached out to Little Brown and Company, publisher, and said, I would love to read a manuscript of this. I heard it's coming out. I want to read it. Can I read it? And they're just like, yeah, sure. And he starts to ask questions that are very incessant. And you can see them starting to back up. Like he starts going, but I thought Patterson was a fiction writer. Like, is this fiction? And they're like, no, it's nonfiction. He goes, well, that's weird, but he's a fiction writer, right? And they're like, yeah. And he just starts asking too many questions. And you can tell that the publisher is starting to feel weird about the conversation. And they finally say, well, if you want to read it, you have to sign an NDA. And he goes, totally, I'll sign an NDA. Some point he signs the NDA, which means that he cannot talk about the book or the things that he reads in the book. That is what an NDA is. Meanwhile, the entire conversation he has with the publisher about the book, the NDA, and everything he knows is forwarded to Epstein. He sends him everything. And so again, like, what side of history are you playing on? The scariest kind of sketchiness that occurred, also, he was invited to the island, by the way. I don't know if he went, but he was invited. The most sketchy things that I came across was during, they talked about Me Too a lot. They thought that they were both a target for Me Too. Shocking. But at some point there's an email, and this is March 8th, 2019, and the subject is Mueller. So Robert Mueller. And Epstein says it's finished, and Michael Wolff says, ballpark me, meaning like, like tell me what's, give me an estimate. What'd you figure out? And Epstein says it's Barr's decision. It's ready to send. I have no further info, but only a guess within 2 weeks. Not sure a leak. Not asking for it, but it would be helpful. I don't know necessarily what that means. My inkling is, as Epstein does, is he was writing something and sending it to Bill Barr during the Russia investigation, which was then, made public a couple of weeks later. But this is something that is definitely inappropriate at the very least, potentially slightly illegal, but also something that Michael Wolff knew about and never talked about during the Russia investigation. So there was just, there were emails about like crushing stories about Dylan Farrow because they wanted to lift up their buddy Woody Allen, who had been so wronged by, I don't know, Amazon, whatever they were mad about. Like, it was this little club of these people who were all well known for the same things, buttering each other up and then crushing any bad publicity around them. And that was Michael Wolff's job. And he did this with Epstein, for a decade, at least a decade. And here was my concern with that. Because in the meantime, the things that we know about Michael Wolff, what he's well known for is writing about Donald Trump and being on the right side of history with Donald Trump. But that's what we thought he was with Jeffrey Epstein. That's what we thought his job was with Jeffrey Epstein, was to gather information and then, submit the truth, right? Submit the truth to help history move along in the right direction, which he clearly was not doing. That's what we thought he was doing. That's what his t-shirt said. But behind the scenes now, and again, I've only read 100 of his emails and I've gotten this much information. We have 1,800 pages of emails of him clearly being close friends with Epstein, traveling around the world, meeting him in places, bringing his family, crushing stories, changing narratives. How can I fix this for you? And so it makes me question, what was his rule for Donald Trump? Because he, second to, like maybe Maggie Haberman, who Trump hates Maggie Haberman, but he is her beat and she knows him the longest and she has written the most about him. But second only probably to her, he has had the greatest access to Donald Trump as a journalist. He has spent many, 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 many times in the White House, interviewing in seclusion, in private, in places that you or I could not go. Well known to the president, accepted by the family. I find it very interesting that he would be sued by Melania Trump when so much of the information that he's gotten from them, he got willingly, and Trump wanted, certain things in his book, whatever. But then I got to thinking about these interviews that Michael Wolff has with Epstein. This has been the crux of the matter on all sides of the coin, on all sides of how you feel about Michael Wolff, is he has 100 hours of interviews with Epstein over a course of years. He claims to be, I believe he claims to be the last person to get information from Epstein, but I don't, I think that's not true because he spoke with his girlfriend the night before. But he has 100 hours of interviews with Epstein that he has yet to make public. And every interviewer under the sun has asked him why that is. And his reasoning for it just doesn't hold water. It just doesn't. His reasoning is that nobody wants it. And I say that I want it. I'm pretty sure that you want it. I'm pretty sure that most people in journalism want those interviews. I'm sure the DOJ wants those interviews. And so the intent behind not making them public, you have to analyze a little bit. Is it purely because, he hasn't been offered a certain financial package for a book that he thought he would get? Maybe. I mean, that's something he commonly looks for. He's a very successful author. He's made millions of dollars in his books. He's also made $800,000 from the American public. Blah 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 blah. So that's option number one, right? Is that he wanted some kind of a publishing deal where he can write a book based on those interviews. I used to think that, and I thought it was a little shady and a little self-righteous. I don't think that anymore. Considering what I know and considering what I've read and considering how this narrative has seemingly changed in the past, I don't know, couple of months, my guess is that much like his relationship he had with Jeffrey Epstein, where he was, presenting one thing but had other things going on behind the scenes, it's likely that the same thing was happening with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is his bread and butter. If something were to happen to Donald Trump where he was no longer in power, and for the most part, we didn't talk about him anymore, that door to that information and that money-making venture, however you want to look at it, would be closed for him. I don't think that's something that Michael Wolff wants. I'm putting words in his mouth. This is just my thoughts. But just having seen it firsthand with a person like Epstein, who had, arguably nearly as much power as Donald Trump at some points in his life, it's not unlikely that he could have had a similar relationship with Donald Trump and still does. We don't know. But because of that, you now have to think of these 100 hours of interviews and what potentially could be on them, and what we know about Jeffrey Epstein and his relationship with Donald Trump. They had a falling out in 2004 over real estate. They wanted to buy the same place. Trump bought it with imaginary money and then flipped it to a Russian oligarch. That is something that Jeffrey Epstein is very willing to talk about. He doesn't always talk about private stuff. He doesn't always talk about illegal stuff. He would be willing to talk about that stuff about Donald Trump, and he did. He did talk about that. He talked about it in his emails. He's talked about it in some of the interviews. And so inevitably, if you have 100 hours of interviews with Jeffrey Epstein, you're going to have a good chunk of information about Donald Trump that could be condemning, could be damning. And it is, in my opinion, that Michael Wolff does not want to release those, because not only does it condemn Epstein, and there's a lot of information there, which, at this point he may probably have come to terms with, it probably condemns him. Things that are said in those interviews probably condemn Michael Wolff himself, just even in so much as just their interaction and their relationship. But probably a lot of stuff in there condemns Donald Trump. And if I don't know that he transcribed those interviews. I don't know that he can edit out pieces that he wants. 100 hours is a lot of work. I don't know that there is anybody now who he could hire to do that objectively, right? None of us are objective anymore. And so now he has 100 hours of interviews that he has to figure out what's on them, because I'm sure he doesn't remember everything that's on them. And now that we see the emails, we know that a lot of it was very inappropriate. That is my opinion. That is all allegedly. But I do think that him hanging on to those interviews stalls the investigation of abuse. And should he decide to release those interviews, he's not going to solve this case, but he is going to move it along faster than it would have been before, with a lot of information, but also, again, it's heavy on the side of Donald Trump, which is also the stuff that we're missing in the Epstein files. So he may not be being encouraged to release those files. There may be people telling him not to release those files. I don't know. But for now, most of us are going, well, hey, they released this many files here and they released this many files here. You can literally just drop 100 hours of interviews in a Google Drive and make that public. Like you can do it. Make it viewable, right? You don't have to give everybody the ability to edit it. Make it viewable. Click the link and send it out into the world. Again, he is one of these people who could be a hero in this story and thus far chooses not to be. And so that is what it is. And so that's what I wrote about this week, and I will link that article in the notes for this live. Let's talk about some questions, shall we? Okay, I'm gonna scroll back a little bit here. Okay. Oh my, so many questions. Okay, I'll try to get to a lot of them if I can. Oh, wait, are those questions? Those are the comments. Ha ha. Okay, maybe I can't see the questions. Okay. Let's see what I can do. I'm an FBI agent. Somebody asked if I'm an FBI agent. I am not. I'd probably be a bad FBI agent. He's entertaining the Daily Beast. I do hope that someone like Joanna Coles, I don't know what her relationship with him is offline, if they're friends outside of like journalism. I just hope for people like that they have all the information, right? And it's hard to have all the information because when I'm finding this, I'm digging deep into millions of files in the middle of the night, and I don't expect that everybody else is doing that. But I hope by me writing it, by other people paying attention to it, that this becomes public information. So there's just accountability, so that she can ask him the right questions. He can have a come to Jesus moment, and then we can move along. Oh, no questions so far. Okay, so do you guys have comments and questions? Okay, so I'm just going to go down and read your comments. Okay, the Angel's Trumpet plant is so beautiful. Yeah, they're in Nepal. Yeah, they're around the world, but that is it's a very heavy date rape drug. And again, there is some discussion of that being grown in Epstein's yard at various properties, probably at the island, because that would have the best climate. Okay. Okay. Do you know about emails showing that Palm Beach Sheriff Rick Bradshaw and his top deputy Mike Gauger conspired with the court-appointed psychologist Stephen R. Alexander to funnel info to Epstein and aid Jeffrey Epstein in getting work release? I don't know specifically about that, but I do know it was just such a shady deal. I mean, I won't assume we all know about the sweetheart deal, but if you Google it, I won't go into heavy detail here. It wasn't done well. I mean, Jim Acosta was compromised and did a really bad job, and he believed Epstein was involved with intelligence, and he gave him a deal that he shouldn't have received. But also somehow the work release supposedly was decided after his plea deal. And Acosta went, "What? We didn't agree to that," but then didn't fight it. I don't know if that's totally true. I mean, that's what's reported. I don't know if that's totally true coming from Jim Acosta. It feels like that would have been something, as like the state attorney general, he would have figured out, or state lead prosecutor, whatever he was. If he was good at his job, that would have been something that he knew ahead of time. What do you think of the initials idea instead of pronouns? That could be. So we were talking about, that things are blacked out in the files. And I mean, it could be either way, but it's so prevalent that it feels like it's mostly pronouns. But it could be that they're initials and that's why they black them out. That could be. All right, let's do a couple more here. Bondi should be scared of a subpoena. Oof. I like Gray Flannel and Rick James. Thank you, Funky. I only know Rick James because of Dave Chappelle. So that was when I was growing up. The radio host stated, "Find out who was at ranch when Epstein died." That will answer more questions. I don't know who was at the ranch, if anybody was staying at the ranch. The ranch is so vague. The ranch is something that emails matter, right? Emails matter a lot because that is where you start to hear the different euphemisms for the ranch. You'll hear NM, you'll hear ranch, you'll hear Zorro, you'll hear Z. So it's really hard to like search by Zorro Ranch because they weren't just calling it Zorro Ranch. And people were just randomly staying there on their way out west. It was like just a stopping off point, but it's so big. It's 8,000 acres. It's his biggest property. I personally believe that it was a hotbed for like some of the tech guys that we now see are popping into the files, because a lot of them were going to TED conferences. They were going to these like Silicon Valley stuff, and they would stay there on the way out there because he'd always be like, "Oh yeah, Peter Thiel, whatever." And I don't know if Peter Thiel stayed there, but like that was a hot spot for people going over to the West Coast for whatever work they were doing, which is mostly like tech stuff. And that would be interesting to figure out who was staying there from that group, because my guess is you'll see some more of those tech bros. Did I say Jim Acosta? Sorry, I meant Alex Acosta. Clarify, not Jim Acosta. Sorry, Jim. No relation. Jim always says no relation. Yeah, Alex Acosta. Sorry, guys. Okay, so if Michael Wolff knew about the sexual abuse, he had a moral obligation to turn him in. Right. That's how many people in this story. You know, like we just saw Clinton be subpoenaed. If he wasn't involved with any kind of sexual abuse, you can only hang out with Epstein for so long and not realize that something is amiss. Even Michael Wolff said and is quoted, that when he flew on the airplane with Jeffrey Epstein in the late 90s or early 2000s to go to a TED conference on the West Coast, that he wondered who all these tall girls were who kept hanging around with Epstein, right? He noticed. He was there an hour and he noticed. So you got to think that somebody who hangs out with somebody consistently for dinners and travels with them for 10 years, they know. Search whoops in the file. Ooh, I will. I'll do that. Thank you. Okay. That's all for today. Happy Friday, guys. Sorry, that was totally unscripted, and you got in the tangled mess that is my brain. So hopefully some of that made sense. Thank you for joining me today, and we'll be back next Friday with whatever happens next week. Who even knows? Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? These are the times that will end up in the history books. But I'm really glad you were here today. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're not already doing this, if you're on Substack, please go subscribe to Blue Ant Media. It is free. You can subscribe to me. It is free. We're all doing this as our jobs. So, of course, if you want to do a paid subscription, that is wonderful. Mine is on sale for $3.75 right now. So it's, big money. But I'm just glad you're here. I'm glad we all have access to this information. And please go out and share it with the world. Please share this video if you liked it. If you're on Substack, please tell your friends, like things you like, share things you want to share. And I'm just really grateful you're here. So go out and do good work. Bye, guys.